And hello once again, and this is another video in the lecture series that I've been doing on here. This time we're going to be looking at national literature. So first off, my name is Lupus, or at least that is the name that I go by on the internet for some reason. So we're just going to jump straight into it. The rest of the stuff we'll look at the end of the video. So first off, national literature. Now, just to say, to make sure that everyone understands what I'm actually talking about when I say national literature, when you think of something like, say, South African literature, American literature, British literature, Indian literature, etc. That is what I mean by a national literature. So we're going to look at what actually is a national literature, and how do we define a national literature, and how do we know that we are actually talking about a national literature. So which nationality I'm going to be looking at is South African, because I'm South African and because it's a very, very interesting one for many, many reasons. So, but this can be applied to other forms of national literature, just obviously with the specific details changed up. So, what is national literature? So there's four main things we're going to look at how we can define it, right? So usually most people, if I was to say, what is South African literature, or what is American literature? You would think it's a very obvious, easy question. So it's literature from South Africa. It's literature from America. It's American literature. It's British literature. It's obvious. This doesn't require any thinking, but it's actually a very interesting one because it's not as clear cut as you might immediately think it is. So we're gonna look at these four things: the language, the location, the citizens, and the themes and ideas. So very, very basically the language of the country, whichever country we're talking about, the location of the country, the citizens of that country, and then the themes and ideas that that country might explore in its literature. So firstly, language. Now you might see here that I put colonial, by which I mean non-colonial, and migration in terms of language. I think I might have just said location, in terms of language. So in South Africa has 11 official languages, but there are more languages. So immediately, when we were to say, okay, well, let's say, American literature must be in English. Okay, but there's a huge Spanish population there, right? So couldn't that also be American literature? Right, now in terms of South Africa, okay, it has 11 official languages. So does it have 11 different types of national literature? Are there 11 different types? Now here's where it gets a bit also confusing, right? Because when it comes to national literature, you're also kind of looking at nation states and believing that nations actually exist. Now, nations are something that we generally just take for granted. We say, oh no, yeah, nations, they exist. It's a nation. Of course it exists. The thing is, nations are typically arbitrary lines drawn on a map, right? There is nothing sort of special about a specific geographic location that necessarily means it is that culture, right? Especially when you look at previously colonized countries, where the lines that were drawn are basically arbitrary lines drawn by colonizing nations, so Britain, Spain, Portugal, France, they would just draw lines on a map and they would decide this is our area. Like if you know anything about what's called the Scramble for Africa, which was a colonial period in which everyone was trying to take over Africa, all the European countries, and they carved it up and they say, well, this is mine, and then the lines kind of stayed like that. And we've now just decided that those are the lines. And then if you take colonizing areas, so Europe, those lines were also often determined through things like war, right? We were like, oh no, well, we fought for this land, so now it's ours. Which is also kind of arbitrary in terms of what is and is not a country. So immediately, this becomes a problem. So in colonial countries, the lines were drawn by colonizers, not by the people who were colonized. And there are still disputes in some areas about which area should be something. Also, you get some places where it's like a non-autonomous region. So there's places like Kurdistan. Kurdistan is in the Middle East. From what I understand, it's sort of the largest geographic area or people who don't actually have their own country. They're inside somebody else's country. They're inside countries like Iraq and Iran. They're inside those countries. Kurdistan isn't a country. It's sort of regions within other countries that I think in some places they do have, they're autonomous, which means they can control themselves. But it's still, that doesn't really work. And then if you also look at places, say in the United States, right, places like Amish areas, the Amish do not conform to the same rules necessarily as the American states, as the regular places, but they're considered to be autonomous regions within a country. So they're not nations, but they're not like part of that nation. So immediately colonial, and South Africa is of course one of those. South Africa was carved up by colonizing powers. And so is that necessarily, is what we call South Africa necessarily correct? And then, as I said, with non-colonial things. So now that could be colonizing powers. So look at Europe or whatever. But then we could also just look at, say, in South Africa. There are regions that have, say, been part of South Africa for so long that they don't really seem to conform to that. So obviously when it comes to, say, border territories, that's often where a lot of the disputes lie. But when you're, say, in the middle of an area, or say in South Africa's case, the lowest regions of South Africa, the southern South Africa, sort of the very, very bottom, which is where I grew up, a place like the Western Cape, which is a province. Now there, you can't have the same disputes you could have in other regions. Perhaps you could say, well, this area has been sort of a part of sort of Southern Africa for so long that it's not necessarily, going to be subject to change like the others. But of course, disputable. Then also comes to like migration. Where do like people with languages, where do these languages necessarily come from, right? Because with all of these, right, in terms of language, with colonial, non-colonial, when these lines were defined by other people, right? When these lines were defined by other people, I also realized I should have probably done location first, but whatever. So when these lines were defined by other people, these colonial people would come in. So in South Africa, as I said, perfect case study in this regard. In terms of language, not all of the languages that are in South Africa were actually from what you would call the nation state of South Africa. The earliest languages are things like the San and the Khoi. They are much sort of older in this region. When it comes to, what about colonial powers? Their languages, right? So these lines were defined by someone else, and then other people came. In this case, it was Dutch and English settlers, which became the Afrikaners and the South African English people. Those are two of the South African national languages. English and Afrikaans are two of the national languages, but they're colonial languages. Now, some Afrikaans people would claim that Afrikaans is an African language. That is something you can argue, but it is descended from Dutch, which is very much a colonial language. It's a British language. It's a European language, right? So they just sort of entered these borders, and they were like, okay, well, we live here. So is it correct to say that English or Afrikaans can create, a South African literature? That they're not from South Africa. And then when it comes to non-colonial, okay, so are they the only ones? So they say the San and Khoi people. Are they the only people who can make a South African literature? Now, when I also said migration, now, there are other parts of South Africa, or, in general, where there are people who, from a foreign perspective, they're Africans, so therefore they're from South Africa, but not really. So the Bantu-speaking people, so people like the Zulus, their origins are not in South Africa. They're more north. They're more sort of Central and West Africa. So yes, they might have come down hundreds of years ago, but they're not actually from South Africa. they entered this arbitrary border, and then it became a South African language. But you could argue that it's not, which of course does go into a whole argument about the origins of where everything comes from, because it's just as a quick European aside, because Europeans tend to like to claim that their little culture is special. However, when you look at the origins of languages, so English is obviously what I've studied, so English is the easiest one to talk about. English does not necessarily come from England. It's actually a form of German. It's a Germanic language. So what happened was the Germans, a group of northern Germans, I believe, they went and moved to England. They actually forced out the original English people, which are the Welsh, or now the Welsh. They pushed them out. And then what happened was there was interaction with the Norse people came. There was a lot of interaction there. And then the French colonized England for about 300 years. And so that's why England has this weird mix of languages inside it, because it was subject to multiple changes over time. So English is an amalgamated language. It's made up of lots of different languages sort of merged together into a unified whole. But then you would say, well, where do the British actually come from? They come from Germany, right? So are British people actually German? But that's also not true, because of course there would have been interaction with the local people, which then eventually led to the modern British person. But you could say, well, they're actually originally from Germany. But then even there, you could say, well, originally, they're not from Germany. Nobody is from Germany. Nobody is from sort of any of these regions, you know. Human beings, evolutionarily, obviously if you believe in creationism, your perspective is going to be different on this. But if you look at evolution, human beings are all originally from Africa. So all humans are Africans, and then they spread outwards into different regions. So the further back you go, the further and further away from the idea of a nation state making sense, it doesn't make sense anymore. But we tend to look at it as it is now. But you see, this already causes confusion. You know, can British, can English and Afrikaans be considered South African languages if they're colonial? And what about is it only the ones that are non-colonial, and the ones that are migrated, are they also not South African because they didn't originally come from here? That becomes an immediate problem. So what language is correct for South African literature? So let's say, okay, this is weird. So let's rather look at the location. Okay, fine. If language cannot be used to define it, so if we're gonna be like, oh yes, it could be this, it could be, okay, fine. We're not going to use language to define national literature. It's location. It's location, right? People in South Africa. If you write something in South Africa, it is South African literature. But what? So only local people. What if you immigrate? And this immigrates or emigrates. So what about people who move to South Africa? Are they now, if they have now they get South African citizenship, are they now able to write South African literature? What if they're German and they move here and then they end up getting a citizenship and they renounce their old citizenship? So they're not German anymore. Legally, they're South African. So can they make South African literature? Or will what they write be German literature? And then the other immigration, if a South African leaves South Africa, do they stop being South African? So probably the most famous instance of this is someone like J.M. Coetzee. J.M. Coetzee is pretty much considered to be like the most famous and critically acclaimed South African author. But he doesn't live here anymore. He moved like 20 years ago to Australia, which also just, for South African people, that is like a long-running joke, white people leaving and going to Australia. But he's still writing. He's still alive. Is his literature South African, or is it now suddenly Australian because he moved to Australia? And of course, his, like, say, if his kids, I don't know if he has kids, I assume he does, but if they grew up in South Africa, are they South African? Or if they grew up in another country, are they that country's people? Now, you might say, no, well, if you leave, then you're not from here. And if you move here, you're not from here either. So it doesn't count. Only local people. What about banishment then? banishment becomes now an issue because, especially during the apartheid regime, there were lots of people who fled this country and then they would go to other, say, African countries or European countries or whatever, and they would write there. So probably the one I know the best is a writer named Bessie Head. And she moved to Botswana, I think, and she wrote a whole bunch of stuff. And she's considered to be a South African writer. But you could say, oh, well, she wasn't here, she left, so she's not South African. But that's unfair. She didn't leave because she wanted to. She didn't renounce her citizenship. She had to flee the apartheid regime. So, okay, location is not okay. And as I said, remember, location is arbitrary because the lines were drawn by colonial powers. So, okay. We can't define it by language. We can't define it by location. Doesn't like you could be a South African living somewhere else. You could be someone else living here. It all becomes okay. Citizens. Okay, citizens. If you are a citizen, then you are South African, right? So of course, if you retain or relinquish your citizenship, so citizenship is a legal process, right, whereby you give up or retain or whatever a legal document saying that you are a citizen of a place. Okay, fine. So this would be, say, if somebody left the country and then they relinquished their citizenship, so moved to Australia. Sorry, I had to do a slight edit there because something happened with my camera. Anyway, so if you relinquish or retain it, does that? So if I keep my citizenship, so I move to another country, but I'm still a South African citizen, I keep my South African citizenship, I still have the document, okay, so that counts. But that's also kind of like unfair. So if I retain or relinquish it, that now determines whether or not I am or am not South African. Now, once again, there were many people who were forced to leave a country and then their citizenship taken away from them. So let's say someone like Karl Marx is a famous example of this. German, banished, lived in England. He didn't actually have a nationality. He didn't have citizenship for sort of the rest of his life after that happened. So what, he stops being German. But now he doesn't even have a citizenship anywhere. He isn't a British citizen, he just lives there. So is he a citizen of nowhere? Citizenship is a legal construct. It is not something real, physical, tangible, whatever. So immediately now, that also is a problem. Okay, it's fine. So none of these can be used to define a national literature. Okay, so it could be any language, possibly, or you could argue it could only be certain languages. Okay, then it's but it's not in a place because what if you leave? And also, of course, when you look at the long-term things, as I said about Bantu-speaking peoples, they're not actually from South Africa. They're from Central and Western Africa, and they migrated here. So their language and their location, they're not actually from here, in the same sense that I am not from here. But of course, I believe that I have roots in South Africa going back to the 1600s. So I am not European. I do not consider myself to be European. Every single one of my, I think maybe the closest I am to European heritage is the 1800s. I know that all of my great-grandparents were all born in South Africa. So I'm like, okay, if they were all born here, well, I don't see myself as European. So this becomes a difficult then situation. So am I South African? I am a white person. I'm British. I also have Afrikaans heritage. My surname is actually Afrikaans. So I consider myself to be South African because I'm from here. But you might disagree. You might say, oh, well, you're actually European. But, But if you were to say something like that, you could also apply that to other people who have been in a place for a very, very long time, right? So you could say something about African people in America, so African Americans. You could say, well, they're not actually American because they're actually from Africa, which is also true of all white people in America. They're not from there. Now, the way that black people and white people got to America is very, very different. One of them came voluntarily, the other one was enslaved. So you could say, well, it's unfair to claim that they're not American because they were brought there against their will. But the only actual people who are Americans are Native Americans. They're the only actual Americans then. So you could argue that if you're looking at a sort of a metaphysical citizenship, so citizenship is obviously a legal thing, but if we were to look at it as if it's something that's like actually inside in your core, you could say that I'm European, I guess, but also I'm a mutt. I'm a mongrel of Europe. I have British and Afrikaans and Irish and German in me. So I don't descend from any one location in Europe. You could just say Europe as a construct. But that isn't very helpful, is it? Okay, so these don't work. Okay, so then themes and ideas. Okay, maybe it has to be about South African things. It has to be about American things. It has to be about British things. But that's also kind of difficult because what is a South African idea? If it originates, is it then therefore? If it originates somewhere, then it must be. But that's just because something originates somewhere doesn't mean it's from there. There's a lot of things that when you think of it, it's not actually like maybe from that area. Like we tend to have this like view, for instance, it's a very Americanized view that slavery is an American thing. But slavery dates back long time. So slavery is not sort of part of any one culture. Many cultures did slavery. Slavery was done in America. Slavery was done in Africa. Slavery was done in the Middle East. I don't know enough about Asia to know whether or not there was also slavery there, but there's probably slavery everywhere. But it's not any one nation's thing. So when we're looking at themes and ideas, why does it have to say, if I write a book that's set in America, I'm South African, but I write something set in America, is it still South African literature? It's about America. So the themes and ideas will not be South African, but is it? I don't know. This is weird and confusing. So that becomes an immediate problem, right? That these themes and ideas do not determine whether or not something is a national literature. So ultimately I come to this question, does it exist at all? Does it exist? Is there such a thing as a national literature? This is the problem with philosophy in general. When you start thinking about something and thinking about the thing, it becomes more and more meaningless and pointless. You start to be like, oh yeah, no, I mean, yes, it does. Well, no, it doesn't really exist because, the language and the location and what it. So this has ultimately been, this entire video has just been petulant whining about something irritatingly confusing, and where we have no answers. It's up to you to decide whether or not you consider that to be a national literature. Remember, this also precludes the idea that nations exist and are not just constructs of colonialism. So it becomes a difficult thing, right? And yeah, that's pretty much national literature. What is a national literature? It's a bit of a irritating, confusing thing, but I think it's very interesting. So hopefully it has been interesting for you too. And that will be then the rest of this video. That is all done. I'm done. I'm not going to leave and do something else. So I hope that you enjoyed this. If you did enjoy this, I've been LC Lupus. You can check out all sorts of things in the description. You can do the usual like, comment, subscribe, share, whatever. You can do those things. Also, if you want to support the things I do here, you can check out my books. Now, you can actually get them, you can either buy them on places like Amazon and Kobo, or you can actually get it for free if you want, with no sign up at all. Actually, I tested just to check on Itch. All of those are down in the description below. 2 books are published so far that you can check out. The first one, right over here, that I'm going to put over here is Cyborg Wilderness. Cyborg Wilderness is a post-apocalyptic story set in after a massive war that sort of ended all life on the planet, and it's about a lone cyborg who is trying to foster what life is left and to try to help bring it back. It's ultimately a hopeful story, and it's also written in what I like to call a stunted style. It has no commas, it has no apostrophes. It's very weirdly written. And then the second book you can look at is, boom, Mostly Rejected. Now, Mostly Rejected is a short story collection. And yeah, there's not really much I can say about Mostly Rejected. It's just, the name is because it received 150 rejections in total, the stories within it. Over 150. I think it was actually 160 something. I can't remember offhand. But yeah, only 3 of them were ever accepted for publication. So, if you want to check out some possibly terrible stories, have a look. And that has been me, that has been this video, and I hope that you have a great day, week, and month ahead. And ta-ta!